Good evening, Madam President.
Good evening.
I've enjoyed listening to the debate thus far, and I do have a lot to say about the proposed bill that's before us, but I am going to start with a couple of questions to the proponent of the bill. And the purpose of my questions really is to kind of get us back grounded in what exactly the public policy debate that we are having is, and what the current law is regarding our reaction to federal immigration authorities as a state, and what this proposed bill would change in that law. So I guess I'll start by asking what the current Trust Act law is, for lack of a better term, through you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Sampson. Senator Winfield.
Through you, Madam President. So I guess I'll start with anything that in here is not underlined basically is the current Trust Act, but specifically the Trust Act currently provides for a lack of response in the way that we would imagine it under the new bill, except that there are exceptions to that, and those are the 7 exceptions that have been discussed throughout the debate. Through you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Winfield. Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you very much to the distinguished chair of the Judiciary Committee. So, would it be safe to say that the current law, the current Trust Act, is designed to prohibit federal ICE authorities from having access to those individuals who may be apprehended by local or state police in this state by creating a state law that asks that those local law enforcement officials do not cooperate in certain circumstances and with the exceptions that we'll talk about? Is that a fair statement through you, Madam President?
Thank you, Senator Winfield.
Through you, Madam President, yes.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. I appreciate that answer also. My goal here really is, I'm not trying to play gotcha. I just want to make sure that we are on the same page about what we're talking about, so we have a complete agreement and understanding about what we're debating and whether or not this is a good policy for the state of Connecticut. So my follow-up question is about this particular bill. In the original Trust Act that was passed in 2013, which I did support along with a lot of my colleagues. I think it passed unanimously actually out of the House chamber. I don't know what happened in the Senate, but I was in the House at the time. We were told that the Trust Act was a bill that was designed to create trust between undocumented aliens that live in our state and law enforcement officials, so that they would be more willing to come forward if they were aware of criminal activity, something like that. And that is a concept that I supported, and I was happy to vote for the bill at the time. I have a little difference of opinion about it now, and I will get to that later. But at the time that bill was passed, there was an agreement, and that agreement basically said that certain individuals we feel might pose a risk to public safety, which I know is something that was mentioned earlier. And those items we put as exceptions to the current law. And those exceptions are being removed in the bill before us. Is that correct through you, Madam President?
Senator Winfield.
Through you, Madam President, I believe Senator Sampson is referring to the 7 items that have been in discussion. If that is the case, the answer is yes.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President, and I thank you for that answer. So let's just list what those 7 items are, and then I will let the gentleman sit down so I can talk about the bill. The very first item that we said as a state when we passed the original Trust Act, we said we are going to do our best to shield undocumented aliens living in Connecticut from federal law enforcement authorities, ICE, except in these 7 cases. And the very first one is individuals that have already been convicted of a felony. And in this particular proposal, that exception would be removed. Number 2, someone who is subject to pending criminal charges in the state where bond has not been posted. Number 3, has an outstanding arrest warrant in this state. I assume that means that if someone is picked up by the Bridgeport Police and there is a warrant from the New Britain Police Department, they could contact the New Britain Police Department, but they could not let ICE officials know about it. In this bill that's before us, if it becomes law, ICE would not be able to be notified. Number 4 is identified as a known gang member in the database that is held by the federal government. Number 5 is identified as a possible match to someone who is on the federal terrorist screening database. Number 6 is someone who is subject to a final order of deportation, which my understanding comes after they've already been through the whole civil detainer process and have been prosecuted criminally by the federal government and are ready to be deported. And then finally, is someone that local law enforcement says proposes an unacceptable risk to public safety. So through you, Madam President, I just want to confirm that what we are changing in this law is we are taking out those 7 items that we used to say pose too much of a public safety risk, and we are essentially going to protect undocumented aliens that actually fall in these categories the same as the other people that we currently protect under the Trust Act. Is that correct through you, Madam President?
Thank you, Senator Sampson. Senator Winfield.
Through you, Madam President, I think what is occurring here is we're reading the same thing but seeing it different. So I think what I am seeing is we are, yes, removing the 7 exemptions and removing them as exemptions that stand out under the law, and saying what we're doing instead is saying you must be able to get a warrant and accompany that detainer, which would allow for you to have the very same exemptions in effect as long as you have the warrant. Through you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Winfield. Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President, and I appreciate the gentleman sharing that information with me. It's really not what I asked, and it's honestly not relevant to my line of questioning, but I will take it up at this point, although I hadn't planned to, because I think it was fleshed out pretty fairly by the previous speaker. The items that we're talking about, the 7 items, are not necessarily having to do with anything that someone would get a judicial warrant for today, because these are items that have happened in the past or already exist. I mean, the fact that someone is on a terrorist watch list is not the reason to get a judicial warrant. It's just a matter of fact. The fact that someone is on a list of potential gang members, or the fact that someone has already been convicted of a felony, is not something that would determine that you need a new judicial warrant for. But nonetheless, I do believe that in 2013, when this passed, the people who served in the House and Senate at the time agreed that those 7 items did make a difference, and that not excluding them and adding the sanctuary protections that exist in this law to those 7 items was just going too far. So I just want to confirm, through you, Madam President, notwithstanding the notion of the additional requirement now that you would have to get a judicial warrant, these 7 items are being excluded when they were once included. Through you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Sampson. Senator Winfield.
Thank you, Madam President. They are being excluded, and yes, I do believe that if you can't get a warrant, I'm not even sure what we're talking about. If the fact that you were convicted in the past doesn't matter now, then it shouldn't matter. If the fact that you're on the terrorist watch list doesn't matter, then it shouldn't matter. If you can't make the warrant, it should not matter. I mean, I don't know how we're talking about people being so dangerous that they're not dangerous. Either you're dangerous or you're not. I just don't fundamentally understand that. I think that's why we have the warrant, because the warrant itself says there are an objective set of facts that suggest that this individual is actually dangerous. It incorporates all kinds of dangers, whether they're listed as exemptions or not. Through you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Winfield. Senator Sampson.
Again, thank you, Madam President. I appreciate the distinguished Chairman of the Judiciary Committee's comments. I genuinely do, and I understand your point very, very clearly. Nonetheless, what we're talking about is the exceptions made about someone's current status, not whether they are subject to a new judicial warrant. And that is adding a further impediment. again, my intention was not to get into this part of the bill at this point, but since we've taken liberty with this discussion, I think we've got to touch it right this minute. The thing is that it is already illegal to enter the country without documentation. And under our federal laws, which are supreme, the federal government has the right to issue a civil detainer to take that person into custody, and they will go through a process, a hearing process, and in some cases a criminal process, and then they will ultimately be deported. There's no debate about that. That's what the federal law is, and the federal law is supreme. And I understand the existence of the Trust Act from 2013 was designed to say that we, as a state, we're going to choose, even though we recognize that to be the supreme law of our state and federal government, we are going to choose, in the interest of public safety, to shield these individuals, undocumented aliens, from the federal law enforcement authorities in the interest of public safety so that they come forward to help us fight other crime. And the point was, back in 2013, we said, it doesn't make a lot of sense if we're trying to get the people that are honest, decent people, other than being undocumented, to come forward, that we should not be including people that have a criminal past or might be, in some cases, people that are potentially dangerous because of these other factors. That's what we agreed to back then, and I thought that was a very, very good compromise at the time, since no matter how you felt about the public policy of creating a sanctuary state, at least we were providing some protections by making sure that this subset of undocumented aliens, who the vast majority of are amazingly good people who are here only because they want a better life for themselves. Madam President, I'll just let the gentleman know that I'm not going to ask him any more questions. I'm just going to go on with my comments. I think is the best thing to do. I want to just say from the outset that there are very few things that we talk about in the legislature that really get under my skin. This is one of those issues. And the reason why is because it is so misunderstood and consumed with politics, identity politics, accusations of bigotry. It is frustrating. I know why I'm here, Madam President. I am here to do my job. And my job is to defend the Constitution, it is to represent my constituents, and it is to make good public policy. That's why I'm here. No other reason. And yes, I'm a politician, and during election season when I'm out there, I play politics, and I try and make sure that I paint my side of the story in the best possible light so people see it my way. But when I come into this room, Madam President, I don't do that ever. I don't do that ever. Ever, ever, ever. If I'm upset about something, it's because I'm upset about it. It's not because I'm trying to put on a show for anyone. And what I want to see here is have a real conversation about what the best public policy is for our state. The word sanctuary state is not a buzzword or a dog whistle. It's an actual thing. It is a law or policy that prohibits local officials from cooperating with federal immigration authorities, period. So we can debate whether or not that's a good public policy or not. I do not want to be accused of using a buzzword when it's something that the people on the street understand. I know a lot of people who are in this country illegally personally. I genuinely do. I have my friend Natalia who lives in Boston. She's a nanny. She's got a young daughter. And I understand her situation, what she goes through. I have another friend who lives in Bridgeport who is also a nanny. I know a very wealthy person who owns a restaurant in a nearby town. And I understand where they come from. I also understand, in speaking with them and being close friends with these people, why they came here. I don't blame them. I love this country. America is the greatest country on earth. It is the land of opportunity. These are not just buzzwords either. people understand what those words mean, and that's why people risk everything to come here. And I don't blame them, but I also don't condone it either. You know, part of what makes our country great is the rule of law. If we start writing policy day after day to ignore our system of laws and justice, what do we have? And I've been watching it happen day in and day out. We got bills about marijuana. It's illegal on a federal level. Our immigration policy is made by the federal government. Now, I don't like what the federal government has done on this subject. I don't think anybody in this room does. But that is the rule of law. And I don't believe that we have a right to decide what the federal law is because none of us were elected to federal office. And I would suggest that anyone who thinks that they can do a better job than our 7 federal representatives, our 5 congressmen and 2 U.S. senators, run for those offices and fix it because they have failed to do so. The bottom line, and I'm going to say a bunch more about this policy in some detail, but the question here before this chamber on this subject matter is not whether we think that undocumented aliens are good people or bad people, or that they're all criminals or they're not all criminals. No one believes that. The question is, do you believe the state of Connecticut should be shielding a small subset of undocumented aliens who are indeed criminals from federal prosecution? That's not all undocumented aliens. And it's certainly not just immigrants, as I keep hearing. I want to start by saying that this bill is not about protecting immigrants. I've heard that said several times referring to the Trust Act. This bill protects immigrants. Well, it's not about immigrants. And in fact, it's not even about illegal immigrants or undocumented aliens. It is about a tiny, tiny, tiny portion of people that happen to be undocumented aliens and also happen to be criminals. And not just because of their status, but because of their actions. And this bill actually aims to put that small subset of people, the criminals that are among the undocumented population, ahead of United States citizens, ahead of legal immigrants, and in fact, ahead of other undocumented aliens that are not criminals. The Trust Act is based on a false premise. I mentioned that the reason why the Trust Act exists is for people to feel that they can trust local law enforcement because they're not going to be reported to the federal authorities and be deported because of the potential of that happening if they contact them to report that their neighbor is a drug dealer or involved in trafficking or something. But that's a fallacy, because in our system of laws and justice, anyone can report a crime. You can report a crime anonymously. And I actually called several police departments and I asked them, do you ever ask? You know, if someone calls up and says, the guy who lives next door is in a gang or he's dealing drugs, do they ever say, by the way, what's your status? And the answer is no, they don't care. That's not the point. There was a study done actually about why people in the undocumented community do or do not contact local law enforcement authorities. And you know what was number 1 on the list of reasons why they don't? They don't speak the language. That's the number 1 reason. It wasn't, oh my God, if I call, I'm going to get deported. The second reason is they don't understand what the laws are necessarily. So there's no proof, and there's no documented evidence. In the Judiciary Committee, I asked recently when we had the debate on this bill, and I also asked in a previous year if anyone could point to me a person who somehow was deported because they reported a crime to law enforcement. And I will listen to the rest of this debate, but I doubt anyone's going to be able to point to that person for me because I don't think they exist. sanctuary policies diminish the trust that you would have in your local police department. Many people that come to this country come from places where the law enforcement is suspect, period, where you have to bribe the guy, the cop that pulls you over for something. What does it say to people that come to this country thinking that we are the land of the free and the home of the brave, and the land of opportunity, that we actually write laws that ignore certain folks' criminal behavior in exchange for others? I don't think it paints a really good picture. It also creates a bad environment because you are essentially giving a place for those who are criminals to hide amongst the population of people that are not criminals because they have the additional protection of that sanctuary policy. And I'm sad to say, and I've heard stories, that it's those criminals that prey on those other undocumented aliens. The problem is that these policies put our citizens at risk. We need to know who is living amongst us. What I would like to see on a federal level, by the way, since we're talking about it, is an immigration policy that recognizes that we are not going to deport the millions of people that are here in this country illegally. But we are also should be ashamed for trying to keep the status quo, because the status quo is terrible. The status quo is that there is a huge portion of our society living in our state, in our cities, as our neighbors, who do not have the same rights as everybody else. That's not a good thing. It's essentially a second-class society of non-citizens. I would much rather see a situation. I don't believe in amnesty. I don't think we should be putting people that came to this country without going through the proper process ahead of people that have. But I also know that we're not going to deport everyone, and that many of these folks add to our society, and some have been here for decades. Some have been here probably, I can't say generations, because I guess that wouldn't make them undocumented anymore. But they are our neighbors. And there is several other ways we could handle that process. A work permit process to allow people to come out of the shadows and actually work without fear of prosecution. So I'm a little out of order because of the way we started this. So I'm just going to make my points as I have them. I already mentioned that sanctuary state policies conflict with federal law, and everyone understands that. But what I want to just point out that the federal government was fully in recognition all the way back in 1996 that there were certain municipalities around the country that were going to attempt to start creating sanctuary policies on their own to ignore federal law. So they actually passed a law prohibiting it. It's called the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, and it was passed back in '96 by Congress, and it prohibits state and local governments from restricting their employees from sharing and receiving information regarding illegal aliens with the federal government. So that is exactly what the bill before us does, by the way. So I just want to make everyone aware that if you vote in favor of this law, you are essentially creating a law that is in direct defiance of the federal law, not just the fact that the federal government has supremacy on immigration, but a federal law that was passed in 1996. I also want to point out that many people that are undocumented, they do work. But as I just pointed out, they are not working under the same conditions and with the same opportunities that the rest of us have. And they indeed pay taxes. But the cost of illegal immigration on our society is enormous. And that is precisely because they do not have the same opportunities that the rest of us have. And I have taken the liberty of printing out a very lengthy report that was produced back in 2017. And it shows the cost of illegal immigration across the country. And it takes everything into consideration. everything. Social services, the cost of education. It also accounts for the taxes that illegal aliens do indeed pay. But the net result is that the state of Connecticut pays $1.14 billion every year in the cost of illegal immigration. Now, most of that is borne in the form of federal taxes, but it is worth noting. And it's an argument that I would use to convince my federal representatives that they need to fix this, that they need to draft an immigration policy that is workable, that allows people to come out of the shadows and actually have opportunities in America like everyone else. I've already mentioned that sanctuary cities are unfair to legal immigrants, people that actually took the time and effort to go through the process. And I know many of them also, and how long they have waited to be reunited with their families and so forth. And I certainly don't want to diminish them in the process of dealing with this conversation. So the bill before us, the purpose of it is to prohibit ICE authorities from being aware of someone that is apprehended in Connecticut that is under a civil detainer. And I will just point out, by the way, that not every undocumented alien has got a civil detainer for them. And I think that's a misnomer that has been spread by the proponents of this bill. If you came into this country as an undocumented person, no one knows you're here. The federal government doesn't magically issue a detainer because you're in the country. They don't know who you are, and they don't know you're in the country. In order to have a civil detainer, that means that you had to have come in contact with law enforcement in the past. And generally speaking, a civil detainer is issued after something has happened. You've come in contact with police, you've had criminal activity, you've been convicted of a crime in the past. That's where the civil detainer comes from. And we're going to debate another bill, I understand, in this chamber that determines whether or not we're actually going to count certain crimes that would make you eligible in the federal government's eyes as defined being a criminal to be counted as someone eligible for a civil detainer. So that's the first thing. We're not talking about people who are just in the country as undocumented aliens. We're talking about people that have had contact with law enforcement already. And this expansion of that Trust Act now makes it crystal clear that what's happening is we are going to say that even those that fall into those 7 categories, which I won't repeat right now, but bear worth repeating, if you are an undocumented alien right now living in Connecticut, how does it make you feel if the goal of the Trust Act was to say, you know what, if you know that the guy next door to you is a bad guy, he is that MS-13 captain, you should have no fear to call law enforcement and tell them about it because we have the Trust Act to protect you. How would it make you feel to know that this bill says that guy gets the same protection as you? How is that making anyone trust anyone? It's absurd on its face. And that's what this bill does. This bill protects people who are criminals, not undocumented aliens who are criminals. I can't say it more clearly. I had this debate in the House a year ago, and afterwards, I got beat up horribly on social media. Oh, that's Sampson, he's a horrible bigot, he doesn't like immigrants, blah, blah, he's a racist. That is nonsense. It is complete and utter nonsense. My family came here from other countries. Everybody in this room probably is descendant from immigrants. The idea that anyone somehow is concerned about not liking immigrants is nuts. What I don't like is bad public policy that puts me or my family or my neighbors at risk. And this policy doesn't just put me and my neighbors at risk, it puts the people who live in the undocumented community at risk too. This bill not just says that we are going to ignore people that fit in those categories, it also says that law enforcement, your local police officer, when he becomes aware of someone who is really a bad guy, he cannot, under this law, notify ICE. He can't even tell them. The bill, I wish I had the language in front of me handy. I would just love to read it to the chamber so that they understand just how explicit it is about how you are not going to cooperate and you are not going to let anyone know that there is this bad guy living in this neighborhood. This bill would make Connecticut even more of a sanctuary state than California. And I bring that up because I'm going to go through a list of crimes that have been committed in a moment. And I just wanted to put that out there. There's also a few other things that were mentioned in the previous debate I want to just talk about very, very briefly. There was the argument made that if you were apprehended committing a crime in Connecticut, you'd be prosecuted by Connecticut, and that is indeed true. And I think that's a relevant situation. But that's not the point here. The point is that if you're referring to that, you're only referring to our local laws. This proposed bill would ignore the fact that you are wanted by the federal government or by another state for some criminal activity. That's a higher burden than it would be for me. That doesn't make any sense. Senator Anwar asked if there was any data to support the claims that this is a risk to public safety. And it just made me think to myself that we don't need data. What we have is countless newspaper articles that anyone can Google anytime they want about victims of crimes committed by those who were subject to civil ICE detainers. And again, for anyone who's undocumented listening, that's probably not you. It's someone that has already committed a crime and is subject to that detainer because of it. And when the federal government, look, there are millions of undocumented people in this country. As I said, not everyone ends up on that civil detainer list. There's something like 3 million people that they are aware of in the country. They put 1.9 million people on a list, and they've only issued detainers for 11,000 last year. It's the creme de la creme that they're after. They're looking for the real bad actors, the ones that we should get, the ones that end up in these newspaper articles. I was going to go through these one by one, but I don't think everybody wants to listen to that. But I will just mention a couple of them. August 2018, undocumented immigrant charged with the murder and the killing of Iowa student Molly Tibbetts. Christian Rivera, 24, a Mexican national who lived in Iowa. For 4 years, murdered Molly Tibbetts while she was out jogging on July 18th of 2017. Forgive me, reading some of these things reminds me that we're talking about real people. And I'll just go back to my opening comments, which is that I'm here for a purpose, Madam President, and that is to make public policy that makes sense and preserves the safety of my friends and neighbors across this state. And I'm not here to play politics. I'm not bringing up these articles to play politics. I'm doing it to show that there are actual consequences that affect real people when we make decisions in here. Here's another one, July 18. Mother grieves loss of son killed in hit-and-run crash. The teen was killed just days before he was to finish his freshman year of high school. Here's one from Bridgeport, Connecticut. December 18th, 2018. ICE detainer placed on 18-year-old accused of killing 12-year-old Clinton Howell. The 18-year-old accused of shooting and killing a 12-year-old boy last week in Bridgeport was arraigned on multiple charges, including murder Thursday. Do we want to see more articles like this? You know, people are going to have different opinions about what the current law is and whether or not that Trust Act should remain or not. But that's not what this debate is about tonight. This debate is about whether we want to expand that Trust Act to include that list of folks that clearly we excluded for a purpose back in 2013 when we passed that law. I got plenty more. I can go on. There are a few more from Connecticut. There are hundreds more across the country. Many of these, if you read them, you'll find out there's things in here that says that they had known gang affiliations. This guy had several names. He has several known gang affiliations. Many of them also say that this person had several ICE detainers placed over several years. There are instances of people who were actually deported and came back and had additional detainers, but were not allowed to be reported to the federal authorities when they came back because those states had sanctuary policies. Madam President, I know I've gone on a long time, and I don't want to go on any longer. I really think I've made all the points I want to. I just hope it's clear to the people listening that this is not the kind of debate that should be about bigotry or what people look like. That's not what it's about. It's about what is right. And I'm concerned about only one thing, and that's making sure that when I go home at night, that my neighborhood is a safe place to go to. And thankfully, I live in a safe neighborhood in Connecticut, and I know other people don't have the luxury of living in as safe a neighborhood as I do. Not that I live in an amazing place, trust me. But we should be working towards making Connecticut a safer place everywhere. And that's New Haven, that's Bridgeport, that's Wolcott, where I live in. This policy does not do that. And I will remind everyone that there's only one question on the table when you vote on this bill. And that question is, do you believe the state of Connecticut should shield criminal, undocumented aliens from federal prosecution? If you believe the answer is yes, by all means, vote yes. But I don't think any of our constituents from any of our districts want us to. Thank you, Madam President.